Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're going to be checking out Portugal. It's becoming like this crazy hub for music from all over the world.
It's wild, right?
Yeah, and we've got this awesome article from TATANKA to help us break it all down.
Oh, yeah, they're really deep into all this music and cultural exchange stuff.
For real. They even
Well,
talk about mixing indigenous chants from the Amazon with like Portuguese fado music.
whoa, that's got to be something else.
Seriously.
Yeah.
And get this, we're also going to learn about this Afro-Indigenous transgender musician named Ahulani, who, like, found her voice in Portugal.
That's awesome.
It is. So are you ready to, like, dive into how Portugal's history is shaping all this musical awesomeness?
Oh, absolutely. Portugal's past is a huge part of this whole thing.
Totally.
You know, for centuries, Portugal was like the seafaring nation,
Right.
connecting with cultures across Africa, Asia, the Americas, you name it. And all that exploration is like baked into their culture and music.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's not just some random thing that happened.
Nope, not at all.
This article's saying that Portugal's history has basically set them up to become a global leader in cultural exchange. Like blending indigenous folk and classical traditions. It's like a musical melting pot, you know?
Yeah, it's simmering with creative potential, that's for sure.
But like, how's it actually happening?
Well, the article breaks it down into three main avenues: embracing indigenous wisdom, reviving folk heritage, and then intertwining classical traditions.
Okay, I'm following you.
And each of these avenues brings its own unique challenges and opportunities, you know.
Totally. So let's start with the indigenous wisdom thing. The article makes a big deal about it, but I gotta be honest, I'm kind of fuzzy on why it's so important.
Yeah, I get that. It's not just about like adding some exotic spice to the mix. Indigenous traditions are deeply tied to spirituality, oral history, and like this profound connection to nature.
Right.
It's about preserving a whole way of life that's often overlooked or pushed aside.
Yeah.
So bringing these traditions into modern music isn't just about the sounds. It's about recognizing and respecting a whole way of life.
Gotcha. That makes a lot more sense. But can you give me an example? Like, how do you actually blend something like indigenous chants with, say, Portuguese fado?
Okay, picture this. You've got a fado singer known for their, like, melancholic vocals,
Okay.
and they're joined by a group of indigenous musicians straight from the Amazon rainforest.
Whoa.
The fado melody, which is already full of longing and saudade, it gets layered with these complex vocal techniques that are totally unique to the Amazon.
Like what?
Think like throat singing or guttural chants that almost sound like the rainforest itself.
That's pretty wild.
It is. And the result is this, like, haunting and powerful fusion. Familiar, yet totally new at the same time.
That's incredible. It's like taking two completely different musical worlds and finding a hidden bridge between them.
Yeah, exactly.
Does the article mention any, like, specific collaborations like that?
Oh, yeah. There have been some really interesting projects with Portuguese and indigenous artists working together.
Cool.
For example, there was this one project that brought a group of 𝗑ᗕᗕ singers from Brazil together with this, like, renowned Portuguese composer.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was. And they created this piece that had traditional 𝗑ᗕᗕ chants, which are known for their crazy polyphonic structures, all mixed with orchestral arrangements.
Oh.
The composer even said it was like a mind-blowing experience that totally changed how he thought about harmony and rhythm.
So it's not just about preserving those indigenous traditions. It's about using them to create something totally new, right?
Exactly. It's pushing those creative boundaries.
Love that.
And festivals are playing a huge role too. You've got the festival Interceltique de l'Orient, which is all about Celtic music and culture, but they've been featuring indigenous artists from all over the world.
That's awesome.
And then in Lisbon, there's the World Music Festival, which is another place where these collaborations are blowing up. These festivals are like incubators for crazy new sounds and unexpected partnerships.
It really seems like Portugal is going all in on this global music movement.
Oh, absolutely. And this article argues that Portugal is in a unique position to lead the way. I mean, they've got the history, the location, and they're building a rep as a center for artistic expression.
Totally. Okay, so we've talked about indigenous wisdom, but what about this revival of folk heritage? What's going on there?
So traditional Portuguese folk music, especially fado, is making a comeback, but with a twist.
Okay.
Modern musicians are taking that raw emotion and those melancholic melodies of fado, and they're mixing it up with contemporary stuff.
Like what kind of stuff?
Think jazz, electronic music, even hip hop.
Wow.
They're keeping the tradition alive while making it relevant for new generations.
It's like taking something old and giving it a whole new life.
Yeah, exactly.
I bet that takes some serious skill to pull off.
Oh, it definitely does. But it's not just about updating the music either.
Oh, okay.
The article emphasizes how important it is to preserve all of the folk heritage, including traditional crafts.
Like what?
Things like azaleo tile work and the super intricate embroidery they do in certain regions. It's all about recognizing the value of these traditions and making sure they get passed on to future generations.
And I can totally see how that ties into the whole, like, intergenerational knowledge transfer thing.
Yeah.
The article mentioned how important it is for young people to learn from those older artisans and musicians.
Exactly. It's about mentorship, apprenticeships, keeping those traditions alive through actual experience.
Makes sense.
You know, there's something special about learning a craft from someone who's been doing it for decades.
Right.
It's not just about the technical stuff. You're inheriting a cultural legacy.
You're right. There's this, like, depth of understanding that comes from that direct connection. It's almost like receiving a gift that's been passed down through generations.
Exactly. And that's something you just can't get from a classroom or a textbook.
Totally. Okay, so we've covered indigenous wisdom and the revival of folk heritage. What about this third thing, the intertwining of classical traditions?
This is where it gets really interesting.
Okay.
So Portuguese classical music, it's got this rich history, heavily influenced by European composers.
I can imagine.
But now there's this movement to bring in elements from all over the world.
Like what?
Think indigenous rhythms, folk melodies, all woven into classical compositions and performances.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's a pretty bold experiment.
That's for sure. But wouldn't that be like a huge change from the traditional classical music people are used to?
It is, but that's what makes it so exciting.
Yeah, I guess so.
Like, imagine a famous symphony orchestra playing a piece that mixes the grandeur of Mozart with the crazy rhythms of West African drumming.
That would be pretty epic.
Right. Or picture a chamber orchestra taking those haunting melodies of Portuguese fado and weaving them into a Baroque string quartet.
Wow, okay. I'm getting it. It's like they're creating a whole new musical language that goes beyond cultures, right?
Exactly.
But is this actually happening? Or is it just an idea?
Oh, it's definitely happening. The article highlights a bunch of contemporary Portuguese composers who are leading the way. They're taking those classical structures and they're blending them with rhythms and melodies from all over the world, making music that's both new and accessible.
So it's like taking classical music, which can sometimes feel kind of stuffy, and making it relevant to everyone.
Yeah, that's a big part of this movement, breaking down those musical barriers and making classical music more inclusive.
I like that. So it's not just about the sounds, it's about creating new spaces for musical dialogue and exchange, right?
You got it. But this brings us to a big question. Do you think mixing all these traditions could lead to, like, losing cultural identity? Or is it more about expanding and enriching those identities?
That's a great question. And something I've been thinking about, too. It's a tricky balance, right?
It is.
On the one hand, you want to preserve the real essence of each tradition. But on the other hand, you don't want to, like, stifle creativity or stop cultures from growing and changing.
You nailed it. It's all about finding that sweet spot where tradition and innovation can not only coexist, but actually enhance each other.
That makes sense.
And it's not easy.
Definitely not. But before we get too deep into that debate, I'm really curious about Ahulani's story. You mentioned she's an Afro-Indigenous transgender musician who, like, found her voice in Portugal.
Yes. Her story is incredibly powerful, and it really gets to the heart of what's happening in Portugal's music scene right now.
Okay.
Should we explore her journey next?
Absolutely. I want to hear how she fits into this whole cultural exchange and artistic expression thing.
Let's do it. Ahulani's story is a perfect example of how music can totally change your life and how it can make you feel like you belong, even in a foreign country.
Okay, I'm ready when you are. So Ahulani's story, it sounds super intense. I'm ready to hear all about it.
Well, try to imagine being Ahulani for a second.
Yeah.
Born in the Amazon, right? Carrying all that incredible Afro-Indigenous heritage.
Right.
And then she ends up, like, ostracized, totally misunderstood, forced to leave her home.
That's awful.
It's tough. And that was Ahulani's reality. She ended up in Portugal looking for refuge, a country known for, you know, being pretty open and accepting of different cultures.
Right.
But even there, she still struggled to find acceptance, to feel like she belonged.
It must have been so hard to deal with those cultural differences and personal struggles, especially when you're already feeling marginalized in your own community.
Exactly. It's a lot to carry. And that's where Tatanka's Orchestra Americana comes in. They're not just any group of musicians. They're like a collective of people who faced similar challenges, people who get how music can heal and empower.
You've mentioned this orchestra a few times. What makes them so unique?
It's like they're this living, breathing example of how music is evolving in Portugal. The article describes them as like a kaleidoscope of faces, this vibrant mix of musicians from all walks of life.
Yeah.
Seriously. You'll find refugees who escaped war, members of the LGBTQ+ community, indigenous artists, classically trained musicians who want to break free from the mold.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
It's amazing they brought together such a diverse group of people through music.
It is, and that diversity, it shows up in their sound, too. They're not trying to create this, like, one-size-fits-all blend. It's more about celebrating each person's individual voice and then finding those moments where their sounds come together in harmony.
So how do they actually blend all those different styles? I mean, it must be a huge challenge to bring together musicians from such different backgrounds.
It is. It's like this delicate balancing act, but they've figured out how to make it work.
Yeah. How so?
They're all about experimentation.
Okay.
In one piece, you might hear the raw, melancholic vocals of fado mixed with like complex polyrhythms from West African drumming.
Oh.
Then in another piece, you might get these soaring melodies from a Chinese erhu blended perfectly with the mournful sounds of a cello.
It's like they're weaving together this giant tapestry of human experience, right? Drawing from all corners of the world.
Exactly. And it's not just about the music itself either. The orchestra is also known for tackling some pretty tough social issues.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Their performances often have spoken word, poetry, even visual art.
Interesting.
It's like this multi-sensory experience that really makes the audience think.
That's really cool. It's great that they're using their platform to talk about social justice, environmentalism, human rights. It's like they're trying to make a real difference, not just entertain people.
Totally. That's what makes them so captivating. They're not just performers, they're activists using music to push for change.
I love that. So where does Ahulani fit into all of this? I'm still trying to picture how her journey connects with this larger movement.
So Ahulani joined Orchestra Americana when she was feeling really lost and alone, like she was struggling to find her place in this new country.
You'll imagine.
And the orchestra, they welcomed her with open arms, embraced her talents and her heritage.
That's beautiful. It must have been such a relief to finally find a place where she felt seen and appreciated.
It was huge for her, and she quickly became a key part of the orchestra. She brought the rhythms and melodies of her Amazonian heritage into their music.
That's amazing. Like, how so?
Imagine the sounds of the rainforest, calls of exotic birds, the beat of tribal drums,
Okay, yeah.
all woven into the orchestra's sound.
Wow, that's incredible. I can only imagine how powerful that must have been for Ahulani and the audience. Did the article mention any reactions to her performances?
Oh yeah, they did. They said her performances were incredibly moving. Like, people were often brought to tears.
Really?
Yeah, they felt this deep connection to her story, her vulnerability, her strength.
It's amazing how music can break down those language and cultural barriers and create this, like, shared experience.
It really is. And for Ahulani, it was a way to, reclaim her voice, to share her story and connect with people who understood her struggles. It showed her that even in a foreign country, you can find a place where you belong through music.
Her story is so inspiring. It shows how powerful art can be and how important it is to create spaces where everyone feels welcome to express themselves.
I completely agree. But let's remember, Ahulani's story is just one example of what's happened in Portugal. There's so many other collaborations going on in local communities, in people's homes. It's everywhere.
That's a great point. We have been focusing on the big picture, but it sounds like this movement is thriving at the grassroots level too. What are some of those smaller collaborations the article talked about?
Well, there was this one project that brought together a bunch of fado singers with musicians from Cape Verde.
Oh, cool.
It's an island nation off the coast of Africa with strong historical ties to Portugal.
Okay.
They started by just sharing their musical traditions with each other, learning about the history and a cultural significance behind each style.
That's a great way to start.
Yeah.
I could see that kind of exchange leading some really cool collaborations.
It did.
Yeah.
They started experimenting with blending fado's melodies and improvisational vocals with the energy and vibrant instruments of Cape Verdean music. It was a true fusion. drawing on their shared history, but creating something completely new.
It's like they were retracing their history through music and finding new ways to weave it all together.
That's a beautiful way to put it. It shows how important it is to understand the history behind these traditions.
Right.
It's not just about borrowing sounds, it's about respecting the heritage they represent.
Totally. It's about acknowledging the lineage, paying homage to all the musicians who came before.
Yeah.
But are there any downsides to this kind of exchange? I mean, is there anything to be cautious about?
That's a great question. While this article focuses on all the positives, there are potential issues to keep in mind.
Okay, like what?
One big concern is cultural appropriation, where elements of one culture are taken out of context or exploited without respect or acknowledgement.
Yeah, I can see how that could happen. It's important to make sure these collaborations are based on mutual respect and a genuine desire to learn from each other, not just taking advantage of something that sounds different or exotic.
Exactly. It's got to be about sensitivity, humility, and a willingness to have open conversations.
It sounds like it takes a certain level of cultural awareness and commitment to doing things the right way.
It definitely does. And it's a constant conversation. We need to keep talking about these things, reevaluating our approach as these collaborations change and grow.
That's a great point. It's not about finding the perfect answer, but more about having an ongoing dialogue, learning from our mistakes, growing together.
You got it. And at the end of the day, it's about creating a world where everyone feels valued and respected.
Well said. Now, as we start to wrap things up, I want to go back to 𝗧𝗔𝗧𝗔𝗓's journey for a moment.
Yeah.
What are your final thoughts on her story and its significance in this whole conversation about music and culture?
I think 𝗧𝗔𝗓𝗪's story really sums up a lot of what we've been talking about. It shows how music can create a sense of belonging, heal old wounds, and give a voice to those who've been silenced.
It's a reminder that even when things are tough, art can give us hope and make us stronger.
Absolutely. It's a testament to how powerful human connection can be.
Beautifully put. Are you ready to wrap up this deep dive with some final thoughts for our listener?
I think so. I think it's time to end this conversation and leave our listener with something to think about.
I'm all for it. What do you got? Okay, so we're wrapping up our deep dive into all things Portugal and music. What's the one thing you hope sticks with our listeners?
If they remember just one thing, it should be that the future of music is all about breaking down walls. Portugal is showing us that embracing different influences, it's not a threat. It actually makes things way more interesting.
I love that. It's not about creating some boring, watered-down world music.
Exactly.
It's about finding those unexpected connections between musical traditions that seem totally different at first.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that music has always been this conversation between cultures. And what's exciting is that Portugal is actively encouraging that conversation, making it a core part of who they are musically.
For sure. We've talked about so much today. The history behind all this, the ways indigenous, folk, and classical music are all mixing together. And of course, 𝗧𝗓𝗪's incredible story.
It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?
It has. And like you said earlier, we've only scratched the surface. There's a whole world of music to discover in Portugal.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And that's what makes it so cool, right?
Yeah.
It's an ongoing exploration, always finding something new, a new sound, a new story, a new connection.
Absolutely. But we got to remember that this isn't just happening in Portugal. It's global. Musicians all over are doing this, blending traditions, creating music that reflects our world.
That's a great point. It's inspiring to think about all the possibilities. But before we get too carried away with that, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the potential downsides of cultural exchange. We talked about appropriation, but are there other things we should be aware of?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's important to remember that cultural exchange, it's not always smooth sailing. There can be tension, misunderstandings, even conflict when different cultures come together.
Yeah, it's not always as simple as just adding things together and expecting a perfect outcome.
Right. Sometimes the results are unexpected and not always good. One challenge is making sure these collaborations are fair, respectful to everyone involved. We got to avoid situations where one culture dominates the other, or where someone's traditional knowledge is exploited for profit without, proper credit or compensation.
Yeah, I see how that could be a problem, especially with the power imbalances we see in the world today.
It's about approaching these collaborations with humility, being sensitive to different cultures, and being willing to listen and learn from each other.
It sounds like a constant process of talking things through, thinking critically, and being willing to adapt.
It is, and remember, there's no magic formula. What works in one situation might not work in another.
So be flexible, pay attention, And be open to learning from mistakes.
Exactly. At the end of the day, it's all about creating a world where everyone feels valued and respected.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one question you want to leave our listeners with?
How about this? How can we each in our own lives help create a more inclusive and welcoming space for music and cultural exchange? It doesn't have to be some big dramatic thing. It can start with simple acts of curiosity and openness.
I love that. We can all play a part in shaping the future of music and culture. And it starts with being open to new things, embracing what's different, and seeing the beauty in what lies beyond our comfort zones.
Well said. So as you go about your day, really listen to the world around you. Notice the music, the stories it tells, the connections it creates.
And hey, maybe you'll even feel inspired to create your own unique blend of music. That's all for today's deep dive into Portugal's musical landscape. We hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, keep exploring, keep listening, and keep the music playing.